Hello and welcome to another episode of Speculative Speculations. I'm Varsha.
I'm Jared.
Steve?
I'm Chris.
I'm down.
And this is a series where we talk about sci-fi stories in all their forms. Today we're going to be discussing up to part 6 of Embassytown by China Mieville. The next discussion will be for the rest of the book. And the short story for today is The Conquest of Gola by Leslie F. Stone. We are working our way through the short stories of the big book of science fiction edited by Jeff and Anne Vandermeer. The short story for next week will be A Martian Odyssey by Stanley G. Weinbaum. And Jared is today a worthless to tax alien to keep with the theme of the short story. But before we get into that, we'll talk about Embassytown first. So, what did everybody think of this part of the book?
We all seen this coming, right? Right? The
Yeah,
border this
I think
descended
so.
into.
But
I mean-
things hit the fan, really.
Perhaps the
Fanwing?
what, but sorry, yeah. Fanwing. The scale of it, I did not quite anticipate. Like it made so a large number of the hosts were addicted, yes, but their buildings and all their biorigs stopped working. That I think was an excellent extension of like taking something that felt almost predictable to scale it up to that magnitude. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the first section that we read was part 4, Addict. And it was interesting seeing how we got to look into how these hosts were becoming addicted to Ezra's voice, and to the point where they were getting violent, right? And they were demanding more, as best as the ambassadors could interpret. And they had to actually have Ezra record, do recordings so that they could, send these recordings out every so often to keep the populace in line, so to speak. I'm kind of curious if he's equating that to something in life. Like, is it basically the Roman bread and circuses type of deal here, or is it? But it's so alien that it's hard to really equate it to something real life. But it definitely is quite the situation when these addicts are so addicted to this thing that society's no longer functioning at all because the humans in Embassytown and other people in Embassytown rely so much on the product that comes out from the rest of the planet there, and that was interesting.
That is a very interesting question because I had the exact same thought, and I did wonder like whether Mieville intended or whether we could map to any real life situations. One that came to mind was the I'm not familiar with the actual history. I've only read historical fiction pertaining to this, but the opium trade in China during the British rule, that seems like it might apply here. There's a similar situation.
Yeah.
I don't know if the breakdown of society was quite as complete as it is in the case of the host, but I think it got pretty darn close.
No,
And-
that's actually a good one. I didn't even think about that. That's a pretty good one. That the level of addiction that came out of the opium trade was extremely high and extremely demanding, because a lot of people were making a lot of money off of it. And I don't think the money thing is quite the same here with the aliens, but I can definitely see the correlation on introducing something, causing an addiction, and then having to keep feeding it.
Yep.
In this case, I think they don't want to keep feeding it. They have to,
Right.
but
Yeah.
as opposed to the real world in which they wanted to keep, people addicted. Here, they're like, it's unintended side effect, I guess.
That's correct. Yeah.
hmm I mean, I think in some ways they do kind of have to, or at least not the people of Embassytown, but Bremen, because of their declared motivations with regards to expansion from Embassytown onwards. At least from Bremen point of view, um I guess it's not clear to us yet whether they could survive on this planet without the hosts, but the options are to rescue everybody there or to do something about the hosts to keep things as the way they are. So in some ways, I guess they might willfully continue to feed something bad. But at this point, I think if they pull out, it's probably worse because they might end up killing everybody. So
The parallel I kind of seen, aside from the opioid or even OxyContin and things like that Liv went on, was our addiction now in current society, especially for Gen Zers to social media, etc. Like you can see how you take something away from that. Like Facebook goes down for 2 hours and like the world blows up in some ways. People can do nothing, just checking to see if Facebook's back up, or Twitter's back up or whatever it is. So there is definitely precedent for this. It isn't quite as ridiculous as it might otherwise seem. And I like the social media one because again, this isn't a conventional drug. They call it the God drug, obviously, but this is very much just somebody speaking. And as we find out, through technology, they're actually happen to do it. And it's unclear to me whether Bremen, they obviously did it maliciously, but whether they were happy enough actually with exterminating so they could basically just sweep in and take the colony and make the outpost. They as opposed to what we thought at start, that we thought this biomass was biorigging was really important resource. They actually don't care about that. It's more about strategic placement of Embassytown rather than anything else. So whether they can kind of move in, make it habitable, and then just take it for themselves is probably their end game, regardless of what happens to either population, the human or the Eric King.
I think if Bremen wanted to kill anything, they probably wanted to keep the status quo as it was, because it seemed from what they discussed when he was discussing that they want to, you can even have independence or whatever as long as you're economically useful.
Yeah.
So I think their plan was just to supplant the ambassadors and just to keep things stable so they could use it as a base, right? So all of this was not what they wanted, I think.
Unintended side effect.
Yeah.
And there seems to be some sort of policy in place on the Bremen side of not giving up on colonies, and actually, like what Wyatt was saying earlier, not earlier, in the next section or two, that they when colonies want to organize and succeed, they actually let them, and then they have the colony need their stuff anyway, so they're under Bremen auspices regardless. And so it's kind of part of their whole plan that they do everywhere.
But again, it's very impact of colonialism. Like how many books talk about colonialism in some form and criticize it in some way. It's kind of the same thing. And when places succeeded from the British Empire, they were like, yeah, you can have your independence. However, you're still in the Commonwealth, you're still part of the trade pact, you're still part of all of that deal, and we still get benefits out of it, so I think it is interesting in that regard. And in a lot of ways, this section of the book kind of asks the question with another 113 pages to go. I thought this section of the book was going to be that section of the book, if that makes sense, in terms of we were going to get a lot of stuff of that regard later. So is it just kind of how do you fight the good fight? Or, it seems like there's plenty of twists and turns still actually to come here, even though it feels like a lot of revolutions happened.
Yeah, I think the question of where do we go from here and how to recover from this, because it feels pretty bleak right now, because how they fixed the situation is by continuing to feed the addiction in yet another way. And they've also figured out how to keep making more of these. So they could continue the decimation of that society if they so wished. But I've read the last page and I know how it goes. So, No, I'm kidding.
No, you're not.
I did. But okay, I was kidding about the I know how it goes part. I did read the last page.
Okay. All right. Well, good game. All right.
Yeah. I think the biggest mystery for me though is I feel like she's gonna play a really big role in the upcoming sections because there's been so much build up to it. And not android, the robot or the
Ursula,
software. Yeah, Ursula. Like, why is she? What's up with that radio silence on her, and why is that significant? It keeps coming up,
Mm.
and yeah, that's what I'm most curious about. I think.
It's also like the fact that we're discussing, oh, what's outside, like from here in the Ember, right? If I didn't know it was just a single book, I would have thought there would be like, okay, well, the end of this book will be in this place, and the next book will be exploring the Ember or something. But I guess not. So
Yeah,
who knows
yeah.
if that will be explored in any way.
There is also a hint that our heroine, she wants to, like, given that opportunity, she would take it to go into that expansionist ships. What are they called? I forget what they're called. There was some other interesting aspects to it. I forgot. What threads would you guys like to talk about first? The husband or the Calvin?
Well-
I think Calvin's incredibly
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, just to go back to the colonialism thing real quick, because that was part of Wyatt's speech when he was trying to save himself, basically, because he was, I guess he was like, he was called out and he was thrown in jail or wherever they contained him, and he says, how crude do you think we are, Bren? They are free, and they're ours, and that's how the colonialism is set up.
Mhm.
And he said, you've been choosing your successors since forever. Congratulations, you invented hereditary power. And I thought that was a great line because it was so it was so facetious. It wasn't. He was basically saying you're doing nothing new here.
Yeah.
What did you think was going to happen? And so that kind of cold water splash in the face, basically, that he throws on them at that point, I thought was pretty cool. I really liked that section and how it came about, and it made everybody kind of rethink how they look at stuff and what they're doing. And I thought it was very cool at that point. But they couldn't stop. They had to go ahead and make the Cal, yeah, and move forward. So that's how that section ended.
But I think one of the interesting things that comes from the Ezcal thing is actually how, even though the ambassadors were being used as this kind of tool for independence or for pulling away, they're basically toys, and still are toys. Like Ez and Cal are still both at the whim of the machine, whether it's of Bremen or of the Embassytown people themselves. Like they are just basically toys. They may as well be robots like Ursula at that stage, because they're like performing monkeys or something at this point in time. That's a function in society, and they never really have much of a choice. And
puppets.
Puppets. Yeah, it's very sad to read. Like, I actually struggled a lot through reading a lot of this, because it is a world that is sort of hopeless in a lot of ways, because there's nobody actually getting. Society's not growing. Their society's not growing in any way. They're kind of oppressing one, controlling another one, and there's no real like blossoming part of society in that case. So I was sort of like in some parts going, I don't know if I like the direction this is going, because it is tough to read about. There doesn't seem to be a happy end here at any stage. And that obviously is still up for play, but it did make it kind of like a lot of those questions being asked going, is this good, or why are they going to get out of it?
So yeah, I think it does show a lot how individual players are not that that you can make a difference, but in the end, a lot of the time, you're just like one little cog in this, I guess, colonial machine. And, there can be good people and bad people, but the system itself imposes certain behaviors. So,
good point.
Yeah. It's interesting, I think, jumping off from Calvin and how much they hated each other. It's interesting how what we found out about how many ambassadors are like that and they're sort of discarded as not valid members of society. And that's sad. Like they aren't even given a place as just like regular twins, for instance. They are just discarded completely as useless. That was very interesting. What? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, but the exception now of Bran, was Brendan, he seems to have like taken himself out of society and made a life for himself. Not the one that he's particularly, contributing massively to society, or that he's particularly happy, but he is kind of existing in a way that the other ambassadors aren't. If you know what I mean, at least he's sort of he's got his own furrow and plan of what to do and what he's been able to do with it, which sort of gives an idea that there is hope for that society. If you know what I mean, the people can do something other than this kind of genetic engineering is essentially what they're doing. That kind of almost trying to create a utopian society, but not succeeding.
Yeah.
Is it implied with Calvin that as much as they try to make like both people into sort of one person thinking the same and being the same, like in the end they're still different?
Yeah.
Right? They still have individualism. They still, different feelings and everything.
Especially if you look at the relationship then between Vin and Avis. You know what I mean? And how that created such a problem between them, so much so that Cal and Thiel were spending an awful lot of time together. And actually, when it came to the suicide notes, both suicide notes were to Thiel, or were to Avis, sorry.
Yeah.
In some ways, and actually not to the other doppel, which again was a very telling thing.
Right.
That suicide note was really interesting because maybe it's the first person perspective or what. I don't know. I didn't get the sense that either of them loved, well, Sile, sure, because she had a whole marriage with him, so I guess they had time to build up that relationship. The way we kept hearing about Calvin, like it was almost like I suppose he couldn't allow himself to love her as much as he wants to because his doppel doesn't agree. I didn't get the sense that he loved her enough to do that over the fact that Sai left, So that was interesting, I guess, both as a revelation of this, but also as it didn't really, I guess it didn't really work for me as like it wasn't super impactful. But to your point earlier about, I think you said something about utopia, Chris. I think that's really interesting, right? Because the way Embassytown is introduced in the beginning, it's like this cute little society where everything's great and things are perfect. It's almost utopian, but it has these hidden secrets about these ambassadors, all of these people who are. It's cute and it looks pretty because it's hiding away, like it's shoving everything under the carpet that it does not like. And also, I think the devolution of the hosts from these ultra respected beings, that they have so much reverence for them. We saw that in a scene in the earlier parts of the book. And now to see them reduced from there to zombies, basically. I think they even make a joke about it in the book that they watched a zombie movie and thought how much their situation is like the Embassytown folks. So to see that devolution, I think, was interesting. And once again, I did wonder what point Mieville is making. Like, what is that actually about? I don't think I have an answer, but just in and of itself, I think it's a very interesting exploration regardless.
Yeah, that is a good question, especially when it comes regarding the reverence to either fearing or just looking at them without reverence and with pity. in some cases, and how that turns around just based upon the perceived actions of the people viewing what's going on. Because the hosts aren't any different. They're still who they are, but it's people's perceived reactions to what the hosts are doing based upon certain stimuli. And so that's a pretty interesting point you brought up about how we build things up in our own minds and how we can just as quickly take them down and restructure how we look at things.
I think one other analogy I have for that, this might get a little weird, but for the whole situation with the addiction and so on, is kind of like the systematic indoctrination that I have been observing in my own country, and I'm sure a lot of other places as well. So I think, and yeah, there is a certain decrease in respect, I guess, that comes along with it, for me at least. So yeah, I guess that is a parallel I can make, but I don't know if that's the kind of thing that Mieville had in mind when he was writing this.
Whole addiction, I sort of pictured it as like the host world was like, it's like one body getting addicted to a substance, and like bit by bit, the body starts craving it more and more. You might, your brain might try to fight it at some point, but it gets like harder and harder. That's how I imagined it. But I'm wondering, do you think that, I've wondered before, do you think that Mieville is trying to, does he have a point? Is he trying to say something? Or, because I've always approached his books as more like an exploration instead of like, getting to a point. But I might be different for different books, or I might be missing something.
That's fair. I mean, maybe I'm misusing the word point. What I am thinking about is more like, what is this about? Like, what real world aspect is he trying to explore with this? Assuming, like, I feel like um there's two options. It's just, hey, wouldn't it be weird and interesting if I just like gave a bunch of hosts some drug addiction, like buggy people some intense drug addiction, and see the fallout from that? It's possible that's all it is, but I it is also possible that there's some real world thing that he then morphed into looking like this. I mean, I'm thinking of how um, Steven Erickson sometimes talks about how he builds upon his themes, right? He talks about how, I am severely misquoting and paraphrasing him, but he says something to the effect that he adds layers upon layers of things on top of his original theme, to the point where you can't recognize it anymore. But if you ask the questions, what is this about, then you might be able to work back an answer. So, yeah, I don't know if Mieville has done some layering and we're trying to work backwards, or if it is drawing parallels from a story that is what it seems. And that's it.
Yeah.
It's
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, sure.
No, I think he is. I think he's definitely weaving in some themes here, and like you said, he did that in Perdido Street Station too. There was a plenty of stuff going on there about society and the different aspects of it and how it all works together. So I definitely think it goes beyond. What if I drugged a bunch of aliens and what would happen? But so I wonder about, because Chris, you brought up that that hope thing, and there doesn't seem to be much right now, and so it makes you wonder: is this Mieville's dark view on humanity? Does he have this stark idea of what humanity is and what they're all about, or not? And I think that the very questions we've been raising in the last 20 minutes here I think that was part of his intent. He definitely seems like a writer who wants you to ask questions and wants you to think about stuff. In on the hope thing, there was one at the end, the last line in part 4.
Yeah.
Addict. She says she knew that Embassytown and I would die, but obviously she's telling a story, so she didn't, unless he does something really weird at the end or whatever. But at this point, we can assume she didn't die, and so is that the sliver of hope? Because she's that, like, the starkness and the reality is that there's no hope here. They're all going to die, or this place is going to be no longer usable, and they got to evacuate or what have you. There's no hope. But the fact that she says that right there, does that give you that slight sliver of hope that something happens other than this place just dies?
Is there any hope for the hosts, though, do you think?
Good question. Don't know. Yeah.
Well, they
They
did.
seem sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, finish your point, because go ahead.
I was going to just say that they switched pretty decisively at some point to be like, well, let's try to help the hosts first, and then like, well, now they're our enemy pretty much. We need to kill them. They vivisect one. They're very much in like, us versus them sort of point. So I can very much imagine maybe Bremen arrives and they're like, well, we'll just kill all the hosts, and that's how we deal with the situation.
So, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, just to kind of compound that a little bit, there is the indication that if everybody in Embassytown dies, they do say that the hosts will probably reinvent themselves in some way. There are factions, enough factions within them that they will probably survive this in some way, but without the people of Embassytown. So I think they have hope. But in terms of this being a symbiotic society, at that point anyway, it was like, no, this is dead. This is broken. We have broken it basically in some way. And back to the previous point, there's no way that this book is apolitical. Like, it's making way too many pointed conversations and questions about the nature of how humanity goes in to colonize or to take a resource, and how it goes about doing it. And it's done it the same way countless times throughout history. I mean, funny enough, Conquest of Gola is another example of it, actually, that quite ties to it quite nicely in a lot of ways. So there are umpteen examples of how this always goes wrong, and how mankind never learns from that kind of thing. And I think it is possible to write a story like this and have it just be a story, but just have those as themes without it necessarily having to be a point. You can explore them, talk about it, think about it, but not actually hammer home a point. And we'll see where it ends up, obviously. But I think I expect this actually to end in a story, if you know what I mean, rather than a point. And it's whether that ends in an upswing or a downswing at the end of it is really where the question is.
Well, I think it's like Vasha said, it depends on what you mean by point. But
yeah. You could imagine that this is just like, well, you can take that, colonialism and this sort of adversarial relationship. It's just how things are, and societies cannot, they might have a fragile balance, but it's very easy to disrupt. And at some point you need to decide, who's going to win. Or maybe it's different. You can take it as, humans are bad and they never learn and they don't, behave in a way that's good for everyone. But we'll see how it ends, like you said, Chris.
Yeah.
Well, what do you guys think about this line? It says, whenever any society dies, there must be heroes whose fight back is not to change.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about a section in where the workers were still doing the work, no matter what was going on around them, no matter all the chaos. The people who were watching the children, the shift parents, were still doing what they had to do, and the some other things too, and so certain institutions, and so there is this underlying current of the basics of life will still happen no matter what big changes a war or a systematic wipeout of or change of government, whatever happens,
I thought that was a great line when I was reading it, but hearing it taken out of context like that, I did wonder, like, at the whether I agree with that statement by itself, because when society dies in this context, the people who are carrying on unchangingly are the heroes. Very much, I agree, but it is also possible that a society dies because of people who don't change, and
Yeah, that's a good point.
in that case, then, like, just that statement in and of itself, I probably don't agree with it, but within the context of this book, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it is a great line where it when they
Yeah, no,
encounter.
I could definitely see if you only read that line and that line only, you'd be like, well, wait a minute, what about all those idiots who hold on to these traditions that are really bad that won't change, And so you could definitely take that line out of context and put it in another situation, and it wouldn't work at all.
Yeah.
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 I took it very much like, like I mentioned before, institutional inertia, sort
Mm,
of things that keep going. It takes a big shock to disrupt like institutions
Yeah.
and how people just behave. If you think about our society, right, it's not very easy to disrupt any specific aspect, right?
Again, lots of examples in history about that. I mean, I was watching something that ends just sort of reminded Oliver Cromwell had to behead a king to bring down a monarchy in Britain and institute parliament, and while history does not remember Oliver Cromwell fondly in any kind of measure at all, it actually brought about the next big change politically and structurally within British society and the British Empire at that time, which is kind of totally to your point.
But throughout all these changes in society, there's always like, the peasants that go and till the fields and I don't know, the hospitals and whatever other institutions that just plug along slowly, changing slowly in the background, right?
what did you guys think of the sorry, new topic, is that okay?
Yeah.
The god drug aspect of it all. There was some very interesting parts about it. I think one that the Arikai, we talked about it a little bit last week, I think, don't have religion because they don't have the lice and therefore the imaginative capability to construct religions and create gods.
Abstract
And
thoughts, right?
yeah, and yet somehow now they are gods. There's one particularly interesting line there that I thought was absolutely brilliant. When they take the chip out of Ra's head after he dies, and they find that there's some biorigging on it, and they wondered if it had been Arikai biorigging and it had gotten addicted, would Ezra have gotten addicted to his own voice? And that was absolutely brilliant. But the god drug of it all, I thought that is not a very key aspect of it, but I found it fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a god drug because language is their god. Literally, like their whole society is based on that language, and the fact that they can't tell lies means they can't actually rationalize a cure. They can't get a cure for this because there is no way to subvert what is happening to them or to explain what's happening because events are just as they are. I think that's incredibly clever because that was set up in the construct at the start to kind of say this is what the society is. This is what this is the way it operates, and that language is about intent and that kind of stuff. And while they can lie about maybe yellow is blue, at a base level, you can't reason with society and convince it to do otherwise. So not only can they not lie, but you can't convince them of something that they don't already believe and perceive. And that's really that's a bit of a philosophical kind of head mangler.
Interesting. Yeah. That did make me think how does this society do with logic, right? Like to your point about reasoning.
Yeah.
So the series of jumps you have to make to decide that something is true or not. But I suppose they just never have to do that because everything ever said is true. But what about implications?
So
This means this.
I think this is exactly where the simile metaphor example topic
Mm,
comes from, right? So if they find something that does not conform to logic, say for instance that somebody would start a book and read the last page first and then go back to first. Just for instance, they would make that a simile to say there
I
are
don't know.
examples where this
I've
happens.
never encountered any situation like that.
But you incorporate it into your language by simile, by basically saying there are things that happen, and this is the exception, and it's called a varsha. But I think that's exactly the function of that simile thing, exactly to explain what you're saying, Varsha, which is very much you've got logic, and then you have the counterexamples or the things that other people do, especially in other races that don't conform to that logic, and that's we'd call it that thing.
This probably needs someone else to do them because they wouldn't do it themselves because they can't conceptualize doing it until it becomes part of a language. I think. Like, did they have like similes which were hosts, or was it only like other species?
No, I think it was just the humans because it wasn't the host who labeled her a simile. It was us who labeled her a simile. The host was just using the word, the sentence to describe her, but it ended up being a simile. The humans made their own terms for what the host considered the humans, I think, and the host still called her she who I forget what the term was. She
who ate what she was told or something, rather than eating for pleasure or eating for function. She did what somebody else told her to eat.
She ate what
she was given. Yeah,
but that was the name she had. That was it. You know, she ate what was given, and the host didn't call her a simile. We said, the humans said, "Oh, that's a simile."
That's
and so she was a simile, and then they started, because like humans do, they classified things and they made Chris an example, and and so on and so forth, and so that to your point about the aliens having their own reasoning and logic, that's as far as it went. And they still seem to lack that ability to lie, as hard as they're trying.
But in that context, a lot of the similes now make perfect sense. If that makes sense, like was Bran a simile himself for the boy that went too far? Like logic should have said when he was struggling. Remember they were doing the race to see how far they could go into the non-Aeola space. His body would have been telling him, go back, you're not in danger, but he went too far, and I think he became a simile for, again, confounding logic. They couldn't get the idea that was a game, or that he was trying to push in the game, So that became a simile. He became a simile himself for that reason, but again, doesn't make any sense because he basically could have killed himself,
Yeah. There's a lot of interweaving of impossibilities in the story. Now I think about it, Sile says, for instance, that the Arikai language is impossible. From the Arikai perspective, the hosts, the ambassadors, or rather Ezra, is impossible, and that's what they're getting intoxicated on. I just thought of another one that I can't remember, but yeah, I think it's really interesting, I guess, what each person thinks it's impossible. And in some ways, Sile was intoxicated a little bit on the impossibility of the Arikai language, and both the sources of intoxication are language. I like that.
It's like probably the limitation of their language is it's not like a hard rule. It's like mostly because they can sort of push it a little bit, right? They can push it a bit with a lying. They can push a little bit with like advancing society very slowly. So maybe it's not fully impossible. It's just very hard, very difficult to find, or
Yeah.
So I wonder what it means, because I think Sile took it as like an absolute, and taken as an absolute then constructed sort of like a religion, but it's probably not an absolute. It's more like something biological, which can be slowly modified or pushed against, which makes it less, I guess, mystical and more like, realistic.
Yeah. Gently push the boundaries to make it. And I guess a lot of their society changed once the humans came. I think even before the god drug, some concept of religion seems to have been introduced to the Arikai society. So yeah, it's I think this is also, now I'm thinking about it, a really interesting exploration of like two societies that are coming into contact with each other. uh I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago as well, but like how they change with each other, I think that is also being explored to a certain extent. So I like that too.
Yeah, and we also got to remember that this is from a narrator's point of view. It's from a
Mm,
certain person's point of view, and so we don't know how much Mieville is only focusing that person's thoughts and how they would think about these things and what they know only.
mm,
Because like she says at one point, no wonder Ezra couldn't survive. The universe had to correct itself. Now that's her viewpoint. We don't
Yeah.
know if that's
yeah.
actually true, that the universe had to correct itself. The universe, who knows what the universe wants, but but that's her point of view on that situation, and so it's an interesting conundrum there, because like even evolution itself isn't this logical machine. It's chaotic, and it wanders, and so um whatever adaptations would happen with contact with these Arakai wouldn't be 100% explainable at all. And so it's there's still a lot of questions about exactly how much change occurred and how much uh, the contact would have affected their society.
Yeah. Yep. One technical question I had was the the people have to they read minds, right? At least that's what the humans have decided. So how do recordings work? uh why are they able to have the same effect that seeing two people speak together? Is it just the way language works, or
They can't be really minds. They must be somewhat reading minds, but also not reading minds. There must be something, an output of the mind, I think, which they're reading, which is not like the thought, it's something. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise that they would think that two different people are like one person, because that's how
Hmm.
their language works, right? It's
I,
I don't think it makes sense. There
yeah.
must be some explanation we're missing. We're probably going to get it at some point, I think.
yeah.
They otherwise would be able to synthesize it. They've been able to do it just by transcoding voice or something. They're not listening to sound waves. They're probably listening to brain waves. And as long as the thing came from an actual being, then it will
Hmm.
contain brain waves rather than, I don't know. But it is an interesting one though, for sure.
Hmm.
But as long as they overlap enough, maybe that's what's happening. If they don't overlap, but they're still speaking language like Ezra, then you get like interference patterns, and that's what makes it different. Instead, before it was just constructive interference. Now it's sort of weird other modulations. I don't know.
I was gonna make a bad joke about the hosts are all behaving like that because they just discovered quantum mechanics, but no.
But I mean, it is phasing. I really like the explanation of how it works and why it kind of something's close but not quite there. It's like almost that I sort of equated it to why people like being drunk, or why people kind of addicted to trying to be an adrenaline junkies, for instance. You know what I mean? So you can live your life, but just with that little extra something, so they put themselves in positions so they get the feeling of adrenaline, and they sort of become hooked on that. It's a sort of similar-ish idea, I think, in some ways. From that, it's like experiencing life, but slightly at a roused and slightly different way. You know.
I think the comparison that was made in the book, at least that one that I noticed, was about with hallucinatory drugs, because of the impossibility of it. It's almost like they're hallucinating this into existence, and that's what they're tripping on.
There must be something with the fawn wings and the way they're interpreting, I don't know, whatever thing it is that they're taking from the brain, I guess, from the intent. I hope we're going to get an explanation, I guess. Right? It might, I don't know, maybe it's, I don't know, synthesizing something into some chemicals, or I don't know, who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Maybe it's like pheromones or something. Who knows?
Possibly. Maybe it's got something to do with the immer. Who knows?
Ooh, I'd like
Maybe
that.
they're in both the immer and the outside, and I don't know, brain patterns go through the immer in the, I don't know. Could be something like that.
I like that. I want that to be true. The next section is called the language list, which I guess we know. I think we know are the people who have broken their fan wings deliberately, right?
Yeah.
So, do you think that they will be who will be key to the rebuilding of the society?
Yeah, but they're called self-mutilators, aren't they? Really, in the book, I think that's the phrase that they used, and that they sort of seen that as a solution. But now they've basically done it themselves for nothing in some regards. But
I mean, they can't really communicate, right? It would be like blinding yourself if, I don't know, if someone was trying to hypnotize you.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
With, and by blinding yourself, that would be like, I don't know, probably 50% of your senses, it seems, for the hosts.
Yeah.
No, so maybe they'll develop some new, I don't know, their mind will change now that they cannot perceive the intent from other people, and they cannot know what's real and what's not real from the language.
Do you think they'll evolve to just process sound instead of the brain waves, and therefore everything?
Maybe it will allow them to do like more abstract thought, maybe.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Oh man, I had a point. I forgot.
Yeah, well,
So
I mean, they should be able to do something different. It should change the nature of language in their society. So things like independent thought or whatever, it should be able to change a mold, but we don't know how they reproduce or anything. They're sort of hatched, isn't it? Was that the implication that was given in the last one, wasn't it? So we don't know how that thinking would kind of infiltrate into the rest of society. Because obviously language is auditory, you hear, there you go, you've been told in much the same way as we get taught stuff. But in our case, because there's a lack of sound, what sense or what way would it pervade throughout society then? Or maybe they become a different class, maybe they become a ruling class. Or they create a function, they create a hierarchy within society because they are not influenced by language or whatever. They can be like librarians if you want, of some sort, where they'll process information and do that kind of stuff. So it might do that.
I like that. Yeah, and they did already mention the formation of hierarchies. I guess it's unclear whether there were hierarchies that are being restructured, or if it was a flat society that is now being hierarchied.
Great word.
What's the?
You could be a science fiction writer with a word like that. Based around hierarchifying.
Hierarchified.
What's wrong with you? Why can't you come into work today? I'm feeling very hierarchified. I like it.
So, Steve's back. I've been dying to ask you what you made of this section so far.
Oh, I threw in the towel. I'm sorry. That's why I've been quiet.
So I did have one more question about why the previous section was relevant. The lying, the shooting of Saul Escher, the dude who could tell lies. And the way our narrator conveyed it to us, it's like she was making sense of later events through the lens of these events. So it seems like right now they feel like just two bad things that happened back to back. But the way she wrote it, it almost feels like they are connected somehow. Did you guys get any clues about what might be going on there?
What was here's the question: was that not orchestrated by Seal and when they were trying to control society at that stage? So he obviously thought he was going to affect it one way. It totally went another one. He went, "I've screwed up. I'm out of here. See you later." And is basically isn't owning his interference in whatever way that he did. He basically started the bloodshed off, and it spiraled off that. And I think it's a bit unfair because I actually don't think one was naturally a cause of the other one. I think the two things were going to happen at the same time, but at the same stage, it did kind of start the cycle of suicide and all the other stuff that was coming, that was to come.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting comparing how, I guess they're both trying to change society, like Ezra changed society in an unintended way, but the other one of those lying was also trying to change society in a different way, but it didn't work. I guess the first one was because they all, like, both the hosts and the ambassadors were all were like, yeah, let's kill him because it's just too much, right? It was like the reactionary forces of, the establishment, like, don't push it too far. Keep the status quo. And the other one is more like violent upheaval of society, I guess. Compared to innovation or peaceful innovation, maybe. Maybe it means, you cannot get peaceful innovation. You have to have radical, violent innovation to, upheave society or upheave the institutions of society.
Yeah, that makes sense. They are they connected? Like, I don't know. I don't remember the timeline between the two events, but is it that the first event, if they had learned to lie by the time Ezra showed up, they would have been more immune as a whole because they'd be more immune to the impossibility? Or
I think you'd have been able to rationalize and say what was happening. There'd have been a way round because the logic would have been broken enough to the point that you could have actually done something like essentially counseling should have worked for them at that stage, whereas counseling can't work for them at this stage because of the nature of the way they perceive things. But you've got, again, there's 113 pages or something to go in this book. Like, you've got to imagine there's a lot of stuff still out there, and I was one of the queries I had when reading this third part was like, we've got so many of the answers. I sort of feel like I understand this world quite well now, which seems really weird given that after 90 pages we sort of were like totally in the dark. It's such a flip around. I'm really quite impressed by it because even from speaking about this, I understand it probably even better and how well thought out and constructed it's been. It's very impressive.
Yeah.
And it's very much at this point, we're not, even when there's like one or two new terms or like a lot of these new terms, we're take them in stride and we understand what's happening. Like, it feels a lot quicker now reading.
Yes.
Yeah, it did. I think I said this last week, but both after the first time, both last week's reading and this week's reading, I did in one batch, and it didn't feel as dense as the first 90 pages did.
So I guess but you kind of need to have a rough start with a lot of introductions to then get a feel for how, the world and everything works. There's a lot of building blocks, I guess, to be put down.
Yeah, I feel like that ought to be true of most fantasy and sci-fi books. Even the ones that lay it out with info dumps, they are called info dumps for a reason. It's just a lot of information in one shot. So, yeah, maybe some authors are distributed better, but others do like Mieville does, and like throw in a lot of terminology that you have to figure out from context, which I don't mind,
That's
but it
how,
makes the initial bit harder. Yeah.
it depends how innovative you want to be and how much you want to rely on existing tropes, right? Because if we think about it, a lot of fantasy, you're like, okay, it's telling you there's a guy on a horse with a bow. It's like, okay, I know what he's talking about. I can already imagine the whole society, how it's structured, their traditions. I'm building already. I have tropes from real life, or it's describing like an orc. Okay, I'm already have a lot of backstory that I can sort of fill in. And that can be either using the tropes to be efficient or being lazy. You can argue in different ways, but here he cannot do that because pretty much almost every one of his works is like new. Everything is new, so you have no frame of reference. And also, like, you might be able to build a backstory, but it's probably not what he wants you to think about that society.
Yeah.
So he has to build everything from scratch pretty much.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you have to wait for more details, so like building the picture little by little rather than like having a picture in your head that you're filling in with details. So I can see how that might be more taxing to read, but ends up being more rewarding if you end up like liking the rest of what it's saying.
It's unique.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take this opportunity to leave the conversation because it's time for me to leave.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Take care, Dan.
Bye, Dan.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. See
Okay,
you.
bye. Thanks for the discussion.
Chris, you were saying something.
God, what's it? I thought as went down. Oh yes, I was just going to say it. There's been a lot of talk about how fantasy and sci-fi especially does these trilogies, right? And the argument has always been that you need a trilogy to build the world as large and as complex as it can. This book isn't that long.
Yes.
It's not very long at all. And in all of the cases with these books, we talk about this quite a lot in the SF Masterworks, you sort of got to respect that your audience will be smart enough to figure some of it out themselves without you laying every bit of it on. That's not to say that every book's going to hit for everybody or anything, but it's one of those things you either do that or you write the geology trilogy where you kind of lay everything out for people. But then, I mean, this is another one of those puzzle box books, isn't it? Where like there's stuff going on, you don't know what it is. We're maybe going to tell you, or maybe not. And either you'll like that or you won't, or you like this version of it or you won't,
It depends on your scope too, because this book is very viewpoint limited. It's like that little town on this little planet, and they, every once in a while the big stuff is spoken about, but it's not really there. It's a limited cast, and it's very, very focused. So he's able to, his universe is built, but he's able to give you that little corner of it, that little spot of it, whereas he doesn't have to build this huge world that is going to come into play later, and have all these tie-in threads into it from different parts of the universe and all that stuff, like most likely like a Sun Eater would, something like that. And so it's a really cool tool in his toolbox to do it the way he did, so that he can tell the story he wanted to without having to do world building beyond that unique little tiny setting he has.
Yeah.
I also love, and did we know this before? Her name was ABC.
ABC.
She's a Avis Bichucho.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes. I needed
That's
you
the
to
first.
spell it out.
It's the first time that I'd ever seen it, and it was like almost like the sly dig at that point to say, "Oh, you think these people are weird, but look what we do. Look what we do naturally." Yeah. I literally called their main character, and it means her name's not Avicii anymore. It's definitely Avis Beavercho, because it doesn't read correctly if she's called Avicii. It breaks it up in terms of meter and stuff. So I think almost certainly she's Avis Beavercho or whatever. But she's ABC. I just thought that was sort of hilarious.
That's hilarious. I did not even notice it. I like that. That's funny.
Little breadcrumbs.
It almost sounds, yeah, but if you say it like a VC, it almost sounds like ABC.
Yeah.
too.
Oh, God, I thought I had that worked out.
Especially if you do it in Spanish,
Mm,
right? ABC.
yes.
Mm.
ABC. Nice.
All
That's
right.
funny.
Are we done making stuff up now, or
Yeah.
We just started.
Only been doing it for an hour.
We got 5 more to go. I saw some blood meridian videos go on for 5 hours. So like that's my new goal now, to talk about something for 5 hours. But jokes aside, are there any sorry?
We could for some. I think we could for like Malazan or
Mm,
like Second Apocalypse or
yeah.
there's a few other ones. We could
Maybe
go on for a
there's
while.
a wrap up of the second apocalypse in our future that'll go on for like 5 hours of marathon discussion.
I am sure there are people that have been listening to this podcast going, I know it only lasts an hour and a half, but it feels like 5.
Chris, come on now.
That could be both a good and a bad thing, you know. It feels really nourishing enough to be 5 hours, or it could be like, good God, are they still talking about
That's
those
right.
2 chapters?
I like that viewpoint better. We give 5 hours of information in 1 hour. I like it. There we go.
That's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think if someone's reading along, I think it'd be. Oh, I don't know. I guess it depends on your viewpoint. But,
So some of these I think go on as long as it takes, or if you're Paramita, more time than it takes for you to read the book. So
Mhm.
I don't know. It takes me. I'm a slow reader. It takes me about an hour for 50 pages or so.
Yeah, I can do about 40 pages an hour. Especially if it's something kind of technically you think, you know, Johnny's pages and the bigger ones, definitely I was doing 20, 25 an hour. Like,
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it'd take me like
Yes.
10 minutes per page.
yeah.
So any other topics on this, or shall we talk about Conquest of Gola? Yes.
Yard
I
can
love-
tell us about his people.
Well, Vasha, we are not worthy. So
Yeah,
all
that
up
is
to you.
true.
all you detax alien. Oh my god. There
That
was
was
an entire page of description of how unseemly humans look.
Yep.
8.5, just about. I started off and went, okay, this is an interesting description, and then I realized at about the 4th line it was describing humans, and then I scanned it to see how long this was actually going to go on for, and I was like, this was not necessary.
And
I was like,
and the-
wow, we are really just crap. I mean, we suck.
And then when you thought you were low enough, it went, and by the way, see if you're a man, you suck even more.
Yeah, you suck even more.
You are the absolute dirt
I
of
know.
society.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and they apparently look like worms, right? Did I get that right? So a worm is telling us, which I think is hilarious, because it's all beauty in the eye of the beholder, a matter
Yeah.
of perspective, and so on and so forth. There's so much you can read into that, but I don't think it needed to go on for a page and a half.
there's a huge missed opportunity in this story. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Yeah. I did wonder if if the story was the origin of that, but then apparently men are from Earth and women are from Venus.
The
Yeah, it
Taxilian.
kind of doesn't make sense when you think about it, though. Right? I
Oh.
mean, when you really, I mean, on surface level, yeah, it's like it's fine and everything, but when you really think about it, it's like,
Do you mean the reproductive aspect?
yeah, I mean, where would humans be, right? There has to be women on Earth, otherwise, there's no.
I think
She
they
didn't say there wasn't
Yeah.
men there. They just were. Yeah, they were just
That-
Not on that ship.
yeah. I think it was
Nothing.
a patriarchal and matriarchal society, not
Yeah.
men only and women only. Yeah.
Because they
Well,
have
I mean,
men as well.
if they were so terrible, then the women would have taken over, right? So I don't know.
Hmm.
It was kind. They were kind of, but I think it's more than just matriarchal and patriarchal. It's also like a capitalist society. They want to be in
That's true,
trade and
yeah.
they want to profit. And it's not about enriching or learning about their culture. It's more about how can I make some cash.
Well, and also about that they looked at their society and thought they were weak because they weren't showing might, if you know what I mean, because they weren't showing that they were a threat to them and posed a threat to them. They didn't, or they were saying that the Detax aliens didn't perceive that they were advanced enough. And obviously, very much to their detriment. But what does an evolved society look like? To the Detax aliens, they think it's trade, colonizing, all of that kind of stuff. The same stuff been talked about beforehand, but actually, an evolved society is doing something different. Although, I think the story sort of disproves the point in the end by just the slaughter that goes on. Then afterwards, the kind of loses that again. That last page, take it out.
Take
Doesn't
it
need
out. I think it made its most important point or its most important theme was at the beginning when it says we don't need to go conquering everything when we are satisfied in who we are and what we do. I guess there is also, to your point about capitalism, Steve, there is also a point that I think the story makes. I don't necessarily agree with it, that because it's a patriarchal society is what led to the capitalist society, which in turn is leading to a lot of like grabby nature of the humans of Earth. But
grabby.
yeah. Okay. I heard that.
You're being very grabby today. You man, you.
Oh man. Did anyone else think that this was almost exactly the kind of story that Shekhawat Hussain told in Sultana's dream? Like their visions were slightly different, and I think the difference in the matriarchal society is essentially like born of the difference in the society of the writers, I think. But the ultimate, I guess, messages in their stories that I got, that again, I don't know that I agree with this, at least society as it stands now, is that, women will build a not for war world and men like to go to war. And so that one, at least, I think was more commenting on oppression. This one, not so much on oppression as the kind of society that men in power have built, apparently.
And how dumb they are is they just keep on trying. They think that what we need is more ships. That's the solution to their problem. We sent 2, but 2 wasn't enough. We'll send 20, 20 wasn't enough. We'll come back. We'll send 50. That'll do it.
Yeah.
So,
It's like when I'm cooking my steak, just add more pepper and add more salt.
And to have enough pepper or something.
Can't have enough.
I'm with you on that.
Man cooking. There we go.
Yeah. there was just one reference to, again, that idea of a symbiotic society where the man held her for a second and she said she felt actually how comforting and actually what kind of good impact being held by a man could have. It was literally one line in the entire story,
Yeah.
and then the man tied her up, and I was like, oh Jesus.
Yeah. It's interesting. I feel like between the two, I like the one by Rukia Shekhawat Hussain a bit more because it's sort of a mirror, right? Like, let me flip everything and now tell me how you like it. Versus this one, I feel like is just sort of calling everyone a fool and not really. It's not here. Think about what you're doing to us. It's you guys are dumb. You don't know how to behave. So
Yeah, it's
That's very much
interesting
it.
because it seems to be somewhat of a common theme that's in a lot of these old sci-fi stories. Because it's also pops up in I'm reading the Rediscovery of Man right now,
Mhm.
and it pops up a lot in that book too. And there's this a theme running through all these old sci-fi stories that for some odd reason there has to be a gender considered better or supreme.
mm,
That
Yes.
it's not. I think the books coming out today, in the 21st century, are a bit more everybody's equal.
mm,
And back then, it seems to be a lot more separating in like this gender is better than that one, and or pointing out differences, and it's just an interesting contrast of how storytelling's evolved over the past century or so.
I think you're totally right there, Jared. But again, it comes back to that point that science fiction stories are about what is happening today rather
Yep,
than what's happening in the
exactly.
future. So around the time this was written wasn't too far from suffrage,
Hmm.
and the women's right to vote, etc. So it is a reflection of
Yeah,
the political nature of life at that time. And it's funny,
yeah, that's
I
exactly
think
my
if you
point.
look,
Yep.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think if you look at today's stories, we have an awful lot about race and culture. About the culture wars is what's coming out in a lot of our fantasy, speculative fiction now in a lot of the ways. And I'm sure people will look back at our stories today and go, "Oh my God, they're all the bloody same." But I do agree. It makes it a bit challenging to read because our conversations have moved beyond that. Hopefully, I mean, in some ways, there's still massive remnants of matriarchal society and what that
Right.
means
Yeah.
in
Well,
terms of. But the conversation is much more nuanced now than what this story is representing.
yeah, our conversations here
Yeah,
have
yeah,
moved beyond that. I mean, there's other parts of the world where it hasn't, but you know,
exactly right. That is so true.
it's a good point.
yeah. Yeah. There is this book called The Power by author's first name is
Yes,
Naomi. Is it Adelman? The last name I forget. But basically, what happens is all the women in the world grow a muscle or something by their collarbone, and that can that does that gives electric shocks sometimes. I think, and
that's right.
so they become the more powerful gender, and then like they I anyway, the book I thought was a really interesting exploration of how whoever it's not about gender dynamics as such, it's whoever has power and is willing to exercise it is who comes to power, or like they have the choice to make about whether they want to oppress the ones who are less powerful or if they want to be more equal. So in that regard, I think, like, once again, I think the story is less nuanced because it's not about a flip in power dynamics so much as, like, it's saying, I feel like it's outright saying women can do things better than men, and I don't know that I agree with that. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's also the redefining and exploring the definition of power and what it is and what that actually means. Is power just being stronger than somebody, or is power something else? Is power a much deeper dynamic that can be explored? And so that's all part of this exploration of humanity that we do in these stories.
And this story, again, another example of how power is wielded. You know, when you have power, like they never actually are worried about themselves or otherwise. But they still brandish it with impunity in much the same way as males would. You know. And,
interesting.
Yeah. She like yells at the guy and then goes to bed, only to wake up and find the city destroyed. Okay, what were you expecting? Like you didn't. There was one other somewhat like unrelated to the central theme of the story, a topic that I wanted to bring up was the spaceships. In this story and in the previous one, apparently there were giant cylinders that showed up in the sky. This was before we sent rocket ships into space, right? So I was curious, like, I haven't looked it up, but do any of you know if there were some like blueprints or like planned technical designs for spaceships that these might have been based on? Because they were both cylindrical. So were the stories just building off of each other? Or was there some like scientific or mechanical reason for that?
Yeah. Well, I know we had been shooting rockets up for a long time before we ever, did space flight. And so I'm picturing them just kind of looking like rockets, like cylindrical like that. And I think man has dreamed of space flight for a long time before it was ever achieved. But I think Chris was coming up with something more scientific.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't more scientific, so I'm thinking about the evolution of science fiction. So the first real science fiction of this ilk was really H.G. Wells with War of the Worlds and something around the turn of the century. And while his vision was definitely more like spider-like, the legs, etc., coming out, the thing I think on top is cylindrical in nature, or is that kind of egg shape on top. So it could be based around the fact that for space flight, it was based on whatever the archetype was for that, which may have been War of the Worlds. I don't know enough about turn of the century science fiction after that fact, but certainly H.G. Wells is looming over the whole genre for the next century. Still remake War of the Worlds every couple of years. It's one of those properties that keeps going away. So there is a cylindrical nature. So it might have been something to do with that idea. I sort of just tried to look to see what the original covers were, through the ages of War of the Worlds, and they don't really back my argument up at all. But I don't know.
Yeah. Oh well. Yeah, I have to look up War of the Worlds, and also all the movies you said are based on that. I don't think I've seen any
series. Haven't seen any of them.
At least not knowingly. It's possible I may have watched some without knowing it's based on War of the Worlds, but I don't think I've watched that much sci-fi actually, so it's unlikely that I
Tom
have.
Cruise version. That is not a popular opinion, but I quite like the Spielberg War of the Worlds, and the BBC TV series is pretty good.
That was all right.
Yeah. Okay, I gotta check those out. I shall.
It'll be coming on Masterworks as well. Don't you worry.
Oh yeah. Like only 3 years from now.
3 years. That's not long to wait.
It'd go by like that.
Yeah. Any other topics to bring up about either story before we wrap up?
So we're up to 1931, just so people know.
Interesting.
That's when this was published. Yeah.
It was a bit after suffrage.
1931. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this exercise of like tracking the corresponding scientific developments that the stories might be based on or building off of. It's nice.
It's pretty smart. Oh, sorry. It's pretty smart to put them in chronological order. I kind of wondered why they did that, and then now that we're reading through it, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It is. My sort of inclination was going to be nice to have a mix, but actually doing it this way lets us explore the political things that are happening around that time consistently week after week and seeing how it builds on. Because we're about to go into the Second World War here very soon, and actually the impact of that.
Oh yeah.
We'll see how things change and stuff. Yeah, that'd be cool. Yep.
That should be cool. All right, then, if there's nothing else, thank you so much for listening. We'll see everybody in a week with the rest of Embassytown and the next short story, which I no longer have open in front of me.
Martian Odyssey.
Actually, I do. A Martian Odyssey. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you soon. Bye.